A freezing dog risked everything to guard this concrete hole. Chapter 1: The Ghost of the Cascades. The wind howling through the jagged spine of the Cascade Mountains did not simply blow, it hunted. It was a vicious, biting force that swept down from the snow-capped peaks of Washington state, carrying with it a sub-zero chill that could freeze the moisture in a man's lungs and turn exposed skin to stone within minutes. It was late January, the dead, frozen heart of winter, and the world was painted in unforgiving, brutal shades of white, gray, and ice. Vance Calder knew this cold better than anyone alive. At 54 years old, with a thick salt and pepper beard and a face heavily weathered by decades of alpine elements, Vance had spent the last 22 years working as the lead track maintenance supervisor for the Pacific Northwest Freight Line. His job was a relentless, grueling routine of inspecting miles of heavy steel rails, clearing blue ice from the automated pneumatic switches, and ensuring that the massive, multi-ton iron leviathans that crossed the state could do so without catastrophic derailment. It was an isolating job, but Vance was an isolating man. Since his wife passed away 5 years ago, and his golden retriever, Ranger, followed a year later, Vance found deep, necessary solace in the quiet hostility of the mountains. He preferred the predictable, metallic hum of the tracks and the scent of diesel exhaust to the complicated, suffocating noise of civilian towns. But for the past 2 weeks, the quiet isolation of Sector 9 had been broken. It started as a rumor crackling over the radio channels among the night shift train engineers. A flash of dark fur in the driving snow. A shadow lingering dangerously close to the active rails. They called him the Ghost of Sector 9. Vance saw him for the first time on a blinding Tuesday afternoon. Vance was driving his heavy-duty, high-rail utility truck along the access road, the cab's heater blasting, when he caught a flicker of movement near a frozen culvert. He slammed on the brakes, the heavy, chain tires crunching aggressively against the compacted snow. There, standing no more than 10 feet from the roaring, vibrating steel of the active tracks, was a purebred German Shepherd. The dog was a walking tragedy. He was dangerously, agonizingly emaciated, his ribs protruding sharply against his sunken flanks like the rungs of a wooden ladder. His beautiful black and tan coat was matted with frozen burrs, gray ice, and dried mud. He favored his back left leg, holding the paw slightly off the freezing ground, trembling violently against the biting wind. But what struck Vance the most was not the dog's terrible physical decay. It was his posture. The dog was not wandering. He was not scavenging the tree line for food. He was standing with a rigid, hypervigilant intensity, his amber eyes locked onto a specific, unremarkable section of the tracks where a heavy concrete drainage grating sat wedged between the massive wooden ties. Suddenly, the deep, mournful, earth-shaking horn of a westbound freight train echoed through the valley walls. The ground began to vibrate. The noise was deafening, a localized earthquake of grinding steel and roaring, thousands of horsepower diesel engines. Any rational animal, hell, any rational human, would have bolted into the safety of the dense alpine tree line. The German Shepherd did not run. As the massive, roaring train bore down on him, blowing a blizzard of snow and pulverized ice into the air, the dog simply flattened his frail body against the icy gravel. He pressed his ears back against his skull, squeezed his eyes shut, and endured the terrifying noise and hurricane-force wind, remaining exactly where he was. Vance watched from the cab of his truck in pure, unfiltered astonishment. The sheer, overwhelming willpower required for a traumatized, starving animal to withstand the terror of a passing freight train without breaking formation was incomprehensible. "What in God's name are you doing, buddy?" Vance whispered to the frosted windshield. When the train finally passed, leaving a wake of swirling snow, the dog stood up on shaky legs, shook the ice from his coat, and immediately returned his intense, unbroken gaze to the drainage grate. Over the next 12 days, Vance made it his personal, unspoken mission to save the animal. He knew the brutal arithmetic of the mountains. If the cold didn't stop the dog's heart, a momentary lapse in judgment near the 90 mph trains eventually would. But the dog was impossibly elusive. Vance tried approaching him slowly, stepping out of his truck and speaking in soft, soothing tones. But the exact moment Vance stepped within 30 yards, the dog would panic, his feral survival instincts overriding his profound exhaustion. He would dart into the dense, snow-laden pine forest, disappearing into the white void like smoke. Vance escalated his efforts. He tried leaving thermal bowls of high-calorie wet dog food and warm broth near the tracks. He would retreat to the warmth of his truck and watch through a pair of high-powered tactical binoculars. The dog would eventually emerge from the trees, sniffing the food frantically, his starving body clearly screaming for sustenance. But instead of eating, the dog would pace anxiously, look at the concrete drainage grate, whine softly, and then retreat back into the freezing woods without taking a single bite. It defied all biological logic. A starving animal does not refuse a free, high-calorie meal unless the fear of the environment completely, totally overrides its hunger. Yet, this dog kept returning to the exact environment that terrified him. By the 14th day, the weather forecast took a dire, lethal turn. A massive Arctic front was moving in from the north. Ambient temperatures were predicted to drop to 20 below zero that night, with wind chills plummeting into the negative 40s. If the dog stayed out in the open, exposed on the ridge, his internal organs would shut down by morning. Vance knew he was entirely out of time. He needed to break the dog's fear, and he needed a bargaining chip so high value it couldn't be ignored. Chapter 2: The Standoff. That morning, before driving up the mountain, Vance stopped at the local butcher's shop in town. He bought a thick, premium cut of raw, bone-in ribeye steak. He didn't care about the exorbitant cost. He only cared about the powerful, iron-rich, irresistible scent of fresh red meat. When Vance arrived at Sector 9, the snow was already falling heavily. Thick, wet, aggressive flakes that stuck to everything they touched, turning the world into a blinding white canvas. The German Shepherd was there. He looked infinitely worse than the day before. He was swaying slightly on his frozen paws, his energy reserves completely, utterly depleted. He was a creature running entirely on fumes, adrenaline, and an incomprehensible willpower. Vance parked his truck a good 50 yards down the access road. He left the engine running, the headlights off, and stepped out into the freezing wind. He explicitly chose not to wear his heavy, neon yellow reflective safety jacket. The bright colors were too unnatural, too intimidating. He walked slowly, dragging his boots through the snow, keeping his body turned sideways, strictly avoiding direct eye contact, a universal sign of non-aggression and submission in the canine world. When he was 40 yards away, the dog tensed, his hackles raising, preparing to bolt into the timber. Vance stopped dead. He slowly reached into his flannel pocket and pulled out the raw ribeye steak. The scent of the fresh meat hit the Arctic air like a physical shockwave. The dog's nose twitched violently. He let out a low, pathetic, shuddering whine, his amber eyes breaking their vigil on the tracks to lock onto the red meat in Vance's gloved hand. "I know you're hungry, buddy," Vance said, his voice a low, steady rumble designed to carry under the howling wind. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help you." Vance tossed the steak. It sailed through the air and landed with a soft, muffled thud in the snow, about 20 yards from the dog and 20 yards from Vance. Vance immediately took 5 large, deliberate steps backward and knelt down slowly in the snowdrift, making his physical profile as small and unthreatening as possible. the standoff began. For 5 agonizing minutes, the dog did not move a single muscle. He stared at Vance, then darted his eyes to the stake, then back to Vance. His frail body was trembling so violently that Vance could see the vibrations from across the distance. The battle between blinding, cellular hunger and deep-seated, feral terror was playing out in real time. Finally, the hunger won. The dog took a tentative, limping step forward. Then another. He kept his amber eyes locked in a dead stare with Vance, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to flee at the slightest sudden twitch. He reached the stake. He lowered his massive, heavy head and picked the thick piece of meat up in his jaws. Vance smiled behind his frozen beard, a massive wave of relief washing over his chest. "Eat it," he thought, silently urging the animal on. "Get your strength up, trust me, and then let me help you." But the dog didn't eat it. Instead of swallowing the life-saving, calorie-dense meal, the dog turned his back on Vance entirely. He limped with a frantic, renewed urgency directly toward the active train tracks. Vance frowned, his brow furrowing as his confusion mounted. The dog reached the heavy concrete drainage grating set between the wooden railway ties. It was a narrow, dark crevice designed by engineers to funnel melting snow and debris away from the steel rails, dropping down into a deep, subterranean culvert pipe. The German shepherd leaned his head over the edge of the dark, icy gap. He opened his jaws and dropped the massive, raw steak directly into the pitch-black void. Then, the dog lay down flat next to the hole, pressing his wet nose against the freezing concrete, and let out a soft, high-pitched, incredibly tender whimper down into the darkness. Vance felt the breath completely vanish from his lungs. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Vance's mind with the force of a physical blow. The dog wasn't returning to this highly dangerous, lethal spot out of trauma or confusion. He wasn't refusing to eat the food left out for him because he was too terrified of the smell of humans. He was starving himself to feed something else. He was standing guard. He was a sentinel in the snow, enduring the terror of the roaring freight trains, risking his own life every single hour of every single day, because something he loved with every fiber of his being was trapped in the earth below. "Oh my God!" Vance breathed, standing up slowly, the blood rushing to his ears. The dog saw Vance moving toward the tracks and panicked. The fear of the approaching human finally overtook his protective instinct. He scrambled to his frozen feet, abandoning the hole, and bolted toward the tree line, stopping at the very edge of the dark woods to watch. Vance didn't chase him. He broke into a dead, desperate sprint toward the train tracks. Chapter 3: The Approaching Leviathan. Vance reached the concrete drainage grate, dropping heavily to his knees on the freezing, jagged track ballast. The wind howled furiously around him, whipping sharp crystals of snow into his eyes. The gap between the heavy concrete ties was barely 6 inches wide, dropping straight down into a deep, vertical maintenance shaft that connected to the main culvert pipe far below the winter frost line. Vance unclipped his heavy, high-powered tactical LED flashlight from his chest harness. He clicked it on, the blinding white beam cutting a sharp cylinder through the gloom, and aimed it straight down into the narrow, icy abyss. He had to squint against the harsh glare reflecting off the blue ice lining the walls of the shaft. The hole went straight down for at least 8 feet. At the very bottom, resting on a pile of frozen debris and dead pine needles, was the raw ribeye steak. And huddled directly next to the steak, shivering so weakly it was barely perceptible to the human eye, was a tiny, fur-covered shape. It was a puppy. It couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. It was a miniature, perfect replica of the German shepherd above, but its eyes were barely open, and its oversized puppy coat was matted with freezing mud and ice. The puppy was hopelessly, entirely trapped at the bottom of the slick, vertical concrete shaft, completely incapable of climbing out. The adult dog had been systematically dropping whatever pathetic scraps of food he could scavenge down this hole for 2 weeks, keeping the puppy alive against impossible, lethal odds. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind that made Vance's blood run completely cold. Hooing. It was the deep, resonant, earth-shattering blast of a freight train horn. Vance snapped his head up, looking east. 2 miles down the track, emerging from the sharp curve of the mountain pass, was the blinding, oscillating triple headlight array of a massive BNSF cargo train. It was moving fast, carrying thousands of tons of steel, timber, and commercial freight. If that train passed over this specific section of track, the resulting vibration and the sheer volume of displaced, compacted snow would bury the grate completely. The puppy would suffocate and freeze to death in the dark, and Vance wouldn't be able to safely extract it. Vance didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy emergency radio clipped to his shoulder harness, his thumb mashing the transmission button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Calder. Emergency! Emergency! Halt all westbound traffic on Sector 9. I have an obstruction on the main line. I repeat, halt the westbound freight immediately." Heavy static hissed through the radio, followed a second later by the panicked, urgent voice of the Seattle dispatcher. "Unit 4, copy your emergency. Transmitting emergency halt code to BNSF 4094 now. Stand by." Vance stood up, pulling a thick, red emergency magnesium flare from his tactical pocket. He cracked the cap against the striker. The flare ignited instantly in a blinding, hissing shower of brilliant red sparks and thick crimson smoke. He held it high above his head, waving it aggressively in wide arcs in the falling snow to catch the engineer's eye through the blizzard. The massive freight train was a mile away, then half a mile. The horrific, deafening screech of metal on metal pierced the valley. The engineer had seen the red smoke and received the radio command. The train's massive pneumatic air brakes engaged simultaneously across a mile of cars, sending bright orange sparks flying from the steel wheels as thousands of tons of forward momentum fought violently against the friction. The train ground to a halting, agonizing, groaning stop barely 200 yards from where Vance stood on the tracks. The silence that followed the screeching brakes was deafening, broken only by the low, idle rumble of the train's massive diesel engines and the relentless howling of the alpine wind. Vance dropped the hissing flare into a snowbank. He keyed his radio again, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Dispatch, the train is halted. I need an emergency track rescue crew out here immediately. Bring gasoline concrete saws, heavy pry bars, and thermal blankets. We have a live extraction under the rails." Chapter 4: The Diamond Saws. For the next 2 hours, Sector 9 became a chaotic, highly focused theater of desperation. The emergency track crew arrived in a convoy of specialized utility trucks, their amber light bars strobing against the whiteout conditions. When Vance explained exactly what was trapped down the hole, there was absolutely zero hesitation. These were hardened, rugged mountain men who spent their lives fighting the elements, but not a single one of them complained about the freezing temperatures, the blizzard, or the millions of dollars in delayed freight schedules. They immediately set up heavy halogen work lights on tripods, illuminating the snowy tracks in harsh, brilliant white light that turned the night into day. The gap between the concrete ties was far too narrow for a human arm to reach down 8 feet, and the concrete ties themselves weighed over 800 pounds each. They couldn't simply be lifted by human strength, and bringing specialized railway cranes up the mountain pass would take hours they didn't have. The Arctic front had arrived, and the temperature was plummeting rapidly. "We have to cut the tie," Vance ordered, pointing to the edge of the concrete block securing the steel rail. "Bring up the diamond saws. Let's move!" The roar of two-stroke, gasoline-powered concrete saws shattered the peace of the valley. Sparks flew like a 4th of July fireworks display as the massive, diamond-tipped circular blades bit fiercely into the heavy, steel-reinforced concrete. Industrial water hoses were sprayed directly over the spinning blades to keep them from overheating and shattering, the water instantly turning to freezing slush the moment it hit the sub-zero air. Vance was on his knees the entire time, ignoring the freezing slush soaking through his heavy work pants. His face hovered inches near the gap, shining his tactical flashlight down into the abyss to monitor the puppy. "Hold on, little one," Vance kept whispering into the dark, projecting as much warmth as he could over the deafening roar of the saws. "We're coming down for you. Just hold on." At the edge of the dark tree-line, illuminated faintly by the harsh glare of the halogen work lights, the adult German Shepherd paced frantically back and forth in the deep snow. The noise of the industrial saws and the shouting men must have been utterly terrifying to his feral instincts, but his protective, paternal bond anchored him securely to the spot. He flatly refused to abandon his puppy. He watched the men tear into the earth with a desperate, whining anxiety, his ears pinned back against the storm. It took 45 agonizing, grueling minutes of continuous cutting to sever a triangular section out of the massive concrete tie without destabilizing the steel rail above it. "Pry it!" Vance yelled, tossing the heavy saw aside into a snowbank. 3 massive track workers jammed heavy, 6-foot steel pry bars into the newly cut groove. They strained against the immense weight, the veins bulging in their necks, their breath pluming in thick white clouds in the freezing air. With a sickening, grinding, cracking sound, the massive chunk of reinforced concrete shifted, then lifted up and out, creating a jagged opening just barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders to pass through. Chapter 5: Into the Abyss. Vance didn't wait for the concrete dust to settle. He stripped off his heavy, insulated winter parka, shivering violently as the -20-degree Arctic wind hit his flannel shirt. He needed his physical profile to be as narrow and flexible as possible to navigate the shaft. "Hold my legs!" Vance shouted to the crew over the howling wind. 2 burly track workers dropped to the gravel and grabbed Vance tightly by the ankles. Vance took a deep, steadying breath, extended his arms straight above his head like a diver, and slid headfirst down into the freezing, jagged concrete shaft. The claustrophobia was immediate, total, and suffocating. The air inside the shaft smelled of frozen dirt, rust, and damp decay. The jagged ice and exposed rebar scraped aggressively against Vance's ribs, tearing his flannel shirt and cutting into his skin, but he ignored the stinging pain and pushed himself deeper, inching downward into the dark like a worm in the earth. "Lower!" Vance grunted, his voice echoing weirdly in the tight, frozen space. The men up top fed him down another foot. Vance's outstretched, gloved hands plunged into the freezing, icy muck at the very bottom of the shaft. He felt the cold, raw meat of the ribeye steak. He pushed it aside. And then, his thick fingers brushed against something incredibly soft, and incredibly, terrifyingly cold. The puppy let out a weak, pathetic, barely audible squeak as Vance touched her. "I got you," Vance whispered, hot tears of sheer relief stinging his inverted eyes. He carefully, meticulously slid his large, calloused hands under the tiny dog's belly. He cradled her securely against his chest, shielding her fragile body with his own bulk to protect her from the jagged concrete walls on the ascent. "Pull me up!" Vance screamed up the shaft. "Slow and steady. I've got her!" The men hauled backward with coordinated strength. Vance scraped his way back up the vertical shaft, the claustrophobic darkness slowly giving way to the blinding, brilliant glare of the halogen lights. He emerged from the hole, gasping violently for air, his face and arms covered in black mud, blue ice, and gray concrete dust. He rolled onto his back in the snow, clutching his prize tightly to his chest. The track crew erupted into massive, roaring cheers, clapping each other on the back and yelling into the storm, but Vance ignored them all. He sat up quickly, frantically pulling a preheated, silver mylar thermal blanket from the open medical kit beside him, and wrapped the tiny, shivering puppy securely inside it. The puppy was a female. She was no bigger than a football, her amber eyes wide with terror, but she was breathing. She let out a tiny, high-pitched whimper, burrowing her freezing nose into the warmth of Vance's flannel shirt. And then, the loud, celebratory crowd of cheering men suddenly fell dead, entirely silent. Vance looked up. The adult German shepherd had broken his perimeter. The terrifying noise of the saws, the imposing presence of a dozen large men, the blindingly bright lights, absolutely none of it mattered to him anymore. He had heard the cry of his puppy. The starving, battered, heroic dog limped slowly and deliberately into the circle of harsh light. The rugged track men respectfully backed away, parting in total silence, like the Red Sea, to give the majestic animal a clear, unobstructed path to Vance. The dog approached Vance, his head held low, his amber eyes fixed entirely, obsessively on the silver bundle resting in Vance's arms. Vance stayed perfectly still. He slowly lowered the thermal blanket to the snow, unfolding the edges slightly, so the puppy's face was visible. The giant German shepherd collapsed heavily into the snow next to the blanket. He let out a long, shuddering, exhaustive sigh, a sound of absolute, soul-deep relief that echoed with the weight of 2 weeks of solitary terror. He buried his wet, freezing nose into the puppy's fur, licking her face, her ears, and her paws with a frantic, desperate, overwhelming love. The puppy nuzzled weakly against her protector, letting out a soft cry of recognition, burying herself in his thick, icy fur to seek his warmth. Vance watched the two of them, the tears finally spilling over his eyelids, freezing instantly on his cheeks before they even hit his beard. He slowly reached out, his bare, scraped hand shaking slightly, and gently laid it on the adult dog's matted, bony back. The wild dog didn't flinch. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't run. He simply leaned his heavy, exhausted head against Vance's knee, looking up at the grizzled railway worker with eyes that conveyed a profound, universally understood message across the species barrier. "Thank you. You're a good boy," Vance choked out, his voice cracking as he stroked the dog's torn ears. "You're the bravest damn boy I've ever seen in my life." Chapter 6: The Watchman. The rescue didn't end on the tracks. Vance refused to let animal control take them. He rode in the back of the heated emergency track truck with both dogs, holding them tight against his chest until they reached the 24-hour emergency veterinary clinic down in the valley town. The attending vet was absolutely astounded. The puppy was severely dehydrated and suffering from moderate hypothermia, but miraculously, she had 0 broken bones or frostbite. The adult dog's body heat radiating from above, and the scraps of food he had painstakingly scavenged and dropped down the hole had kept her alive against impossible odds. The adult dog was treated for severe, life-threatening malnutrition and a torn cruciate ligament in his back leg, but after an 4 drip and a warm bed, he was declared stable. When the vet handed Vance the intake clipboards and asked for the names of the dogs for their permanent medical charts, Vance didn't even hesitate. "The big guy is Titan," Vance said, looking through the glass at the sleeping, majestic giant in the heated recovery kennel. "And the little one is Echo." That was 3 years ago. Sector 9 is quiet again. The snow still falls heavily over the Cascade Mountains, and the massive BNSF freight trains still roar through the valley, shaking the earth with thousands of tons of steel. But Vance Calder no longer works those lonely tracks by himself. Sitting proudly in the passenger seat of his high-rail truck, his massive head sticking out the window to catch the freezing mountain breeze, is Titan. He is no longer a battered, starving, terrified ghost haunting the woods. He is a massive, healthy, majestic animal with a shining black and tan coat and bright, fiercely alert eyes. And curled up on the heated floorboards of the cab, sleeping soundly and safely through the loud rumble of the diesel engine, is Echo. She grew into a beautiful, spirited, incredibly smart dog, fiercely loyal to her father and to the man who pulled her from the dark. Every single time Vance drives past that specific concrete drainage grate at Sector 9, he slows the heavy truck down to a crawl. He looks over at Titan, and Titan looks back at him. It is a silent, enduring acknowledgement of the miracle that happened there in the snow. A reminder that in the bleakest, most unforgiving, hostile corners of the world, love can make you endure the impossible. Love can make you stand your ground against a roaring train. And sometimes, love is the only thing powerful enough to pull you out of the dark. The end.
Thank you for listening to today's narrative. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button right now. It's the best way to help the channel grow. To never miss a release, subscribe to the Fiction feed and turn on notifications. See ya!